Okay, so do you remember last time I said that this is not a, military history class? I'm going to emphasize that again. If you're wondering why I am flying through some of these battles, I want to mention the ones that are important and why, but not dwell too much on the details. So I apologize if that is your thing. Just some things to remember about what's been going on, and particularly in the war in the Pacific, because I want to start with Europe and I don't want us to be too confused with the back and forth. So let's start with Europe and then we'll come back to what's going on with um, the Pacific theater. So here you have the Axis powers: Germany, Italy, Japan, and what their goals are. And then the Allied powers, the United States, Britain, and the Soviets, their goals are to stop the Axis powers, right? So let's start with the war in Europe. Hitler was everywhere. Churchill doesn't think the Allies are ready to directly invade Europe. Um, they are still getting all of them are still getting their feet on the ground again, their feet back under them, I should say, after World War One in terms of troop strength. And so Churchill decides to recommend instead to start attacking on the periphery, specifically beginning in North Africa. The American invasion of North Africa will be led by Eisenhower, future President of the United States, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He will face German troops for the first time at the Battle of the Kasserine Pass. Um, this is where General Patton will make a name for himself. Eisenhower will bring Patton in to help at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. They will fight until May, and the Americans will finally be successful at pushing the Germans back. Why are they starting in Africa? Well, they want to start, number one, they decide to start with a relatively small troop commitment. It gives the army time to gain experience. And number two, the Suez Canal is in very real jeopardy. This is British controlled. It's a vital supply line for Britain. And if it were to fall into Nazi hands, it would be very crippling for the Allies. The commander that the Allies face in North Africa is this man. This is the German commander, General Erwin Rommel. His nickname was the Desert Fox. And he is probably, well, he is one of the most brilliant minds, our most brilliant military minds in modern history. Had he been allowed to control the military operations for the Nazis, the outcome of the war may have been different. Hitler did not allow him to do that. Hitler made many of the big decisions himself, and in fact was so frustrated with Erwin Rommel's failure to execute some of Hitler's poor decisions that he instructed Erwin Rommel to commit suicide, and he did. They do face the Desert Fox in Africa. Um, at the battle in particular of El Alamein. They're defeated here in 1942, but they continue to be a threat in North Africa for the duration of the war. This, of course, is Eisenhower. This is a little bit of a map of some of the battles that I've been mentioning here. The Battle of the Atlantic is a giant battle. It spans years. And I think I've got this enlarged. Yeah, so you can see on the far left, that's the Battle of Atlantic in 43. In the middle, 44. At the far right, 45. So it has to do with trying to get convoys of supplies from Britain to Russia, from the United States to Britain. The Germans are trying to disrupt those. The Allies are trying to get those through. And so you have Britain and Russia starting to travel in wolf packs, or excuse me, the Germans were traveling in wolf packs to try to sink these ships. So the United States decides to organize the ships into convoys and also utilize some new technology, radar, sonar. And it means that the Americans are able to sink U-boats faster than the Germans can produce them. So it is both an air and sea battle, this Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of Stalingrad is the bloodiest confrontation of the war. Over 1 million are dead. It lasts, we'll say, 200 days. The Germans need strategic materials. The Volga River is a valuable supply route, and so that's why they are in Stalingrad. The Germans are winning for much of this battle, but they get stuck. They start in September, which is far too late, right? Learn the lessons of Napoleon. They get stuck in Russia in the winter, and as the Russian army often says General Winter is undefeated in Russia. And so many civilians die. They starve to death in Stalingrad, and many troops perish as well. The Soviets are begging the Allies to join, to open a second front, to get out, they say, get out of Northern Africa and get into Europe and relieve some pressure from us. Because right now in Europe, in the theater of Europe, you have USSR versus Germany. France is gone, and Britain and the United States are fighting in North Africa. The Soviets are incredibly frustrated at what they see as lack of support from the Allies. In 1943, there is a meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill where they say, let's go, let's move, let's get into Europe. They say they're going to move through Italy. They call Italy the quote unquote soft underbelly of Europe. And they also decide they will begin to increase the bombing of Germany directly and only accept unconditional surrender. Let's see here. After the invasion, following the invasion by July of 1943, Mussolini has been deposed and arrested. Italy will ultimately surrender, but Germany will continue to fight in Italy. So they're still fighting in Italy after 43, but it's not Italians, it's Germans. This is a great cartoon. Mussolini was incredibly inept at pretty much everything, including maintaining, managing, motivating an army. And so Germany was really hampered. Hitler thought he could rely on Mussolini to control what was going on in Southern Europe and not have to send troops down there, but he ends up having to. So in the end, Hitler will be fighting the Soviets in the East. He'll be fighting for Mussolini in the South. And then eventually he'll be fighting in the West when the Americans and the British open a second front in Europe. Towards the end of the war, there's a meeting that I mentioned this in Tehran. It should say that, but it doesn't. The Tehran Conference, Tehran, because it's in Tehran, Iran. In 1943, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill will meet to decide how they will structure this post-war world. They say Stalin will launch a full-scale assault once the Allies invade France. They agreed to divide Germany. Stalin and Roosevelt do. Stalin will, and that's what will result in a lot of these, Cold War tensions in Germany and Berlin. Stalin will agree to help with Japan, the U.S. with Japan, after Germany is defeated. And they agree that they need a more substantial peacekeeping organization. Spoiler alert, that is the UN, the United Nations. D-Day is more formally known as Operation Overlord. By the way, the operations in Africa had been Operation Torch, moving up into Italy. But this is Operation Overlord. They're going to drive the Nazis out of France. They're going to send them home for a final defeat. There are multiple beaches. There's Omaha, Juno, Gold, Utah, Sword. They divide it up, right? Where are the Americans fighting versus where are the British fighting? The Germans were expecting an invasion at Calais. The United States had managed to trick them into thinking that they were about to invade on that beach. They were not. June 6th of 1944, it's the largest amphibious invasion. It is not, the D&D Day doesn't stand for anything. It's really just day. It's like the day. Let's see, what else do I want to say? We've all seen Saving Private Ryan, right? We've all seen those movies and those video clips of soldiers trying to make landfall and get out of their boats and make it onto land, many of them dying in the water. It was incredibly deadly, but somehow the Allies take the beach. And this is the beginning of the end for the Germans. Eisenhower is famously said to have looked at the weather that morning and said simply, okay, we'll go. Like, it's a good day to do this. Here are the beaches. So you can see the Americans are fighting at Utah and Omaha, the British at Gold and Sword, and the Canadians right there at Juno. The Battle of the Bulge is really the last gasp for Hitler and the Germans. It's December 16th of 1944. It's fought in the border area of Luxembourg, France, and Germany. They're freezing. There's a lot of frostbite. General Patton will come in with some fresh reinforcements, and he will be the deciding factor in that battle. it will end in retreat for the Germans. This is the first time also that the Allies will come into contact with concentration camps. There's a little clip about it.
During the Bulge, command broke down, supplies broke down, morale broke down, communications broke down, everything broke down. It was every man for himself. We were inadequately clothed. We didn't have rubber overshoes. We didn't have overcoats. We didn't have gloves. We didn't have scarves. My boots were so bad, I would strip newspapers and drapery off of the bombed out houses and wrap my feet in it. You were having trouble breathing because the snow was suffocating you. And consequently, we lost a lot of men who froze to death.
Okay, so meanwhile, what's going on? The Russians had pushed Germany out of Poland. They're already marching toward Berlin. The Americans move in from the west, so they're being squeezed. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide in a bunker underneath Berlin. On May 7th, 1945, the Nazis surrender. And on May 8th, it's VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. Roosevelt doesn't live to see the end of the war. He dies while in office on April 12th, 1945. So President Truman will be responsible for overseeing the rest of the war, which is why when we get to the atomic bomb in a minute, it will be Truman who makes the decision to drop it. So let's switch gears and talk about the war in the Pacific. So stretch for a second. I'm going to go quick. After Pearl Harbor in the Pacific, this is General Douglas MacArthur there smoking his very famous corncob pipe. One of the first things that the Japanese seek to do is gain ground in the Philippines. This is, remember, American controlled since the Spanish-American War, and the Americans are forced to leave the Philippines, leaving behind a small force of American soldiers as well as Filipino soldiers, who the Japanese quickly capture and march 65 miles. There are about 78,000 men who are forced to participate in this Bataan Death March, as it's known. This is where they are headed. This is the route of the Death March. Almost 10,000 of them die. General Douglas MacArthur vows that he shall return to save the people of the Philippines. And After having been ousted from the Philippines by the Japanese, MacArthur, to his credit, does work for the rest of the war to get back to the Philippines, working his way there battle after battle, starting at the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Southwest Pacific, and finally culminating in the largest battle in naval history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. He says when he returns at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, people of the Philippines, I have returned by the grace of Almighty God. Our forces stand again on Philippines soil. The Japanese are defeated at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, but not decisively, and there will still be fighting in Manila when the war ends, even in 1945. The other two battles that you are probably most familiar with when it comes to the war in the Pacific are Coral Sea and Midway. In response to the U.S. threat in the Pacific, the Japanese decides on a two-prong attack. The first is going to be to destroy American supply lines in Australia. This effort will be the Battle of the Coral Sea. And the second is to destroy the American fleet at Midway, and this, of course, will be the Battle of Midway. They attempt to keep most of their operations secret, but the United States, specifically in the Battle of Midway, they are able to decode the Japanese communications, and so they are prepared for these secret attacks. The United States, though, during World War II, uses a code of their own, and it is the Navajo language. The code talkers, as they are known, are the Navajo men who are responsible for conveying the code back and forth. And our code, the Navajo code, will never be cracked, but it's a secret until 1971. Nobody knows of the contributions of those code talkers. Here is a map of the movements of the Battle of Coral Sea. So you can see how very close to Australia they were. It is an air and sea battle. And Japanese loses almost all of its planes. The Japanese lose almost all of their planes. This is the Battle of Midway. It's in June of 1942. Japan's plan is to trick U.S. aircraft carriers into a trap. The U.S. forces will be led by Admiral Chester Nimitz. They will suffer a significant loss of material and men. I mentioned the importance of code breaking. Both sides lose significantly, but it is a turning point in the war. And after the Battle of Midway, U.S. victories become much more frequent. So you can remember the Battle of Midway for two reasons. A, turning point, the Midway, and B, just sort of, I always think of its location as sort of midway in the Pacific, even though neither of those are 100% accurate. There's another map of the movements during the Battle of Midway. Island hopping is a strategy that the United States is going to use during the war in the Pacific. The Pacific Islands are going to be used as stepping stones to get to the Japanese mainland. This starts in about 1943. So take Island A, hop from Island A to Island B, from Island B to Island C, from Island C to Island D, and ultimately all the way to the island of Japan. But geography is a problem. The islands in the Pacific are very spread out. They're incredibly rocky, and so they couldn't land on a beach. You had to park a vehicle in the water some distance off the coast, and then soldiers had to wade onto the island. So it was very difficult to capture these islands if they were enforced with Japanese troops, and oftentimes they would use this piece of equipment down here on the bottom right, this alligator. By capturing the Mariana Islands by August of 1944, it allows American B-29s to get close enough to the mainland Japan to start actually bombing Japan. The Battle of Iwo Jima is also in February of 1944. We need, again, airfields closer to Japan. Incredibly difficult geography. The Japanese had built underground concrete bunkers into the rocky terrain of the island of Iwo Jima. And so the United States takes incredibly heavy casualties. This is just an image of the terrain. But they are able to endure and achieve victory. And I know you guys have all seen this iconic image of the soldiers lifting the American flag on Iwo Jima. And they are all identifiable people. They all have names. I think that's pretty cool. Okay. We, of course, know that the end of World War II in Japan is the atomic bomb, which we will discuss. But before that, led under the command of General Curtis LeMay, the United States, once it gets close enough, decides that it's going to start firebombing Japan. B 29s dropped bombs filled with napalm onto various cities of Japan. For example, on March 9th of 45, they firebombed Tokyo. More than 80,000 are killed. These are not military engagements. These are ostensibly civilian targets. They will bomb 67 cities. And there is a real question about the issue of proportionality. Should the United States be firebombing these civilian targets? It's the same question that we'll ask with the atomic bomb. Was it proportional? Was it justified? With the atomic bomb, Truman always said that it was the least bad choice, right? He was happy he made the choice. He never well, he wasn't happy, I shouldn't say that. He never doubted that he made the wrong choice, but he always said it was between a horrible choice and a, devastatingly horrible choice. So he picked the horrible choice. We'll talk about that in a moment, but there's a really great documentary called The Fog of War, where they interview Robert McNamara, who was involved in politics in various capacities from World War II through the Cold War. And they talk to him in particular about this moment. And they're going to give some statistics about the firebombing of these cities in Japan that I think you'll find it as interesting as I do.
50 square miles of Tokyo were burned. Tokyo was a wooden city, and when we dropped these firebombs, and it just burned it.
The choice of incendiary bombs, where did that come from?
I think the issue is not so much incendiary bombs. I think the issue is, in order to win a war, should you kill 100,000 people in one night by firebombing or any other way? LeMay's answer would be clearly yes. McNamara, do you mean to say that instead of killing 100,000, burning to death 100,000 Japanese civilians in that one night, we should have burned to death a lesser number or none, and then had our soldiers cross the beaches in Tokyo and been slaughtered in the tens of thousands? Is that what you're proposing? Why was it necessary to drop the nuclear bomb if LeMay was burning up Japan? And he went on from Tokyo to firebomb other cities. 58% of Yokohama. Yokohama is roughly the size of Cleveland. 58% of Cleveland destroyed. Tokyo is roughly the size of New York. 51% of New York destroyed. 99% of the equivalent of Chattanooga, which was Toyama. 40% of the equivalent of Los Angeles, which was Nagoya. This was all done before the dropping of the nuclear bomb, which, by the way, was dropped by LeMay's command. Proportionality should be a guideline in war. Killing 50 to 90% of the people of 67 Japanese cities and then bombing them with 2 nuclear bombs is not proportional in the minds of some people. I don't fault Truman for dropping the nuclear bomb. The U.S.-Japanese War was one of the most brutal wars in all of human history. Kamikaze pilots, suicide, unbelievable. What one can criticize is that the human race prior to that time and today has not really grappled with what are, I'll call it, the rules of war. Was there a rule then that said you shouldn't bomb, shouldn't kill, shouldn't burn to death 100,000 civilians in a night? LeMay said if we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. And I think he's right. He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals. LeMay recognized that what he was doing would be thought immoral if his side had lost. But what makes it immoral if you lose and not immoral if you win?
To me, it's a fascinating conversation. And I think we all know about the atomic bombing of the 2 cities in Japan, but we don't know about the prior firebombing of the multiple cities in Japan. And so I wanted to make sure I include it. Very soon after this begins, we have the Battle of Okinawa, and we see this. He references the use of kamikaze, which the word kamikaze literally means divine wind, where these Japanese pilots would turn their bodies into weapons and weaponize their planes. So they would get into these planes and they would fly their airplane into the American destroyers or American aircraft carriers. In the Battle of Okinawa, more than almost 8,000, I should say, almost 8,000 Americans are killed, but 110,000 Japanese are killed, including kamikazes. 2 generals commit suicide, and it really displays this Japanese willingness to fight to the last man, to not surrender. And some of that plays into the idea and the decision to drop the atomic bombs, to drop these nuclear weapons on Japan, because otherwise they would not surrender. There would be fighting in the streets. As he says, tens of thousands of Americans would be killed storming the beaches of Japan, trying to make it onto mainland Japan. And then, would civilians have fought for their emperor, for this military leader, Tojo? What would have happened? This is an image of a kamikaze pilot getting ready to take off. And here is a picture of one right before he leaves with a puppy, which is just heartbreaking. He's 16, I think 16 or 17 years old. And of course, we know this decision to drop the atomic bomb. We'll be talking about the Manhattan Project. The first test of one, it happens in New Mexico on July of 1945. Prior to the dropping of the bomb in Japan, the Americans drop all these leaflets onto these Japanese cities saying, if you don't stop, we're going to unleash something on you like you've never seen before. Well, they've just experienced all this firebombing. They're unfazed. They think, what could it be, right? What could it be? How bad could it be? After the first one drops, they say there's no way. They have 2. How many more could they have? And the Americans say, oh, we have many more. In fact, they only had 2. They drop the second, and that's what prompts the Japanese surrender. So, hope you learned a little bit here, and just reach out if you have questions about anything.